We would like to acknowledge the traditional territories of the people of the Treaty 7 region in southern Alberta, which includes the Blackfoot Confederacy, comprising the Siksika, Piikani, and Kainai First Nations, as well as the Tsuut'ina First Nation and the Stoney Nakoda, including the Chiniki, Bearspaw, and Wesley First Nations. The City of Calgary is also home to Métis Nation of Alberta, Region 3.
Well, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to the very international audience we have with us today. My name is Alan Charanet, and I am the Projects Coordinator of the Extractive Resource Governance Program, or ERGP. On behalf of my team, I want to welcome you to this discussion and to thank our guests and partners for their very hard work in bringing it to life. Today's webinar is entitled Red Flares: The Fight for Transparency and Sustainability in Africa, and it's part of the ERGP's international series. These types of initiatives are so important to us at ERGP because they bring together diverse experience in the field of resource governance, and they underscore a really key element of our mandate, which is partnership. The ERGP works in extractive and natural resource governance, both here in Canada and around the world, while growing knowledge networks and building capacity. Our program, located at the University of Calgary School of Public Policy, centers on training and education, technical and strategic advising, research and analysis, and global projects. We invite you to get to know us online at ergp.ca, where you can subscribe to our newsletter and to follow us on LinkedIn and Twitter if you're not already part of our network. Today, we're going to be exploring some critical themes in transparency and sustainability in Africa, and we'll be looking at governance through the lenses of community, accountability mechanisms, and environment. Some takeaways from the webinar will include a sense of the legal, regulatory, and social frameworks necessary for responsible resource extraction. We'll be looking at the ways that communities, industry, and governance practitioners are working together in these initiatives, and we'll see the challenges and the achievements in sustainability through case studies thanks to our panelists. I'm going to take a couple of minutes to introduce our guests, and then I'll turn the session over to them. Just to note that the full biographies of today's panelists will be available to attendees following the webinar. To begin, I'm very glad to introduce Akachukwu Okafor, who is an energy, environment, climate change, and natural resource governance specialist based in Nigeria. Aka is a member of the Technical Advisory Committee on Green Economy at the Nigeria Climate Innovation Center, and also the Nigeria National Focal Point, Transport and Climate Change Global Status. As an author and researcher, he also belongs to a number of organizations at national, regional, and international levels, and has consulted on mining, energy, climate, agriculture, and environmental initiatives around the world. Importantly, and of special interest for our discussion today, Aka has led several grassroots stakeholder consultations and engagements, capacity building, and gender mainstreaming projects in resource governance. Aka and I actually first imagined this webinar many months ago, so it's wonderful to see it being realized now. Also joining us from Nigeria is Dr. Orji Ogbonnaya Orji, who is the Executive Secretary of Nigeria's Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative, or METI. Dr. Orji has extensive experience in international development and public service, being highly specialized in transparency and accountability dynamics and mechanisms. He's worked in management positions in government and for the United Nations Development Program, and has managed several World Bank and US aid projects on public sector reforms. Notably, Dr. Orji was among the team that piloted Nigeria's public procurement reform program, and we're honored to have him with us today. We very much appreciate the efforts of you and your team, Dr. Orji. From Ghana, Benjamin Boache is an energy governance professional and the executive director at the Africa Center for Energy Policy. Ben has made contributions to extractive sector governance in Ghana and across the continent, with much focus on corporate, fiscal, and contract governance, as well as institutional development and the evolution of legal frameworks for effective resource management. He's also consulted for the World Bank, UNDP, and a variety of research institutions while working closely with host communities and analyzing stakeholder issues in development projects and revenue distribution. He presently chairs the Stakeholder Committee of the Millennium Development Authority, advising its board on the implementation of power sector reforms. It's wonderful to have you with us, Ben. Our fourth guest is an ERGP technical expert from Kenya. Albert Musando is an ecological restoration specialist, an environmental educator, and a biodiversity ecosystems manager with decades of experience in mining and quarrying industries. He's an incredibly talented teacher who most recently joined the ERGP's collaboration with UM6P University in Morocco as a guest instructor on the Mining Environment and Circular Economy Master's Program. He's also taught alongside ERGP and their partners at Kipya Africa in Kenya on ecological restoration in mining and quarrying industries. I actually believe Albert has stepped away from the field today to be with us, so a huge thank you to Lafarge Ecosystems and Bamburi Cement for releasing him. And finally, I have the great pleasure of introducing Justine Sweet, an environmental attorney at Herbert Smith Freehills, who joins us today from South Africa. For nearly 20 years, Justine has provided specialist safety, health, and environmental legal support in multiple industries, including in relation to mining projects both inside and outside South Africa. She's been a key member of the Herbert Smith Freehills team responsible for drafting regulations under Saudi Arabia's mining investment law. Justine also served as in-house specialist counsel to a South Africa-based global petrochemical company, working on issues of implementation, strategic planning, and environmental law. Justine, it's great to have you with us on the panel today, and please give our best to Peter and the team at HSF. With that, I'm going to turn things over to Aka to begin our discussion. I will be monitoring the Q&A throughout, so please feel free to use it throughout the conversation, and then we'll come back and speak to questions during the question and answer segment. So with that, Aka, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Alem, for those introductions. Welcome, participants and panelists. I would like to start by framing the topic for this discussion. And when we started this discussion, we took a picture of a ship with all stakeholders in the extractive industry that is sailing. And in that ship, you have the regulatory institutions, the governance structures, you have the private sector, you have the civil society, you have the environmental activists, you have the host communities as the passengers, who in an event of a shipwreck will lose their lives and therefore has responsibility to call for help when something is going wrong, to save the ship, and in this case, extractive industry, operations or business. And in the extractive industries, all stakeholders have a share in upholding and improving transparency, else a situation may arise that could sink the ship and everyone will lose. In Africa, transparency and sustainability has become a very serious discussion topic, especially as mineral resources will play significant role in development of low carbon energy system with demands from minerals rising beyond 500% compared to current demands. Also, the situation in Ukraine and European nations' search for natural resources elsewhere, particularly gas, may mean that Africa's oil and gas sector will receive new attention for supplies. Incidentally, when we started this discussion months ago to develop this webinar, it never occurred to us that the situation in Ukraine will get to where it is today with Europe and other countries dependent on Russia's gas looking for supplies elsewhere. So this topic is important today because it hopes to improve the dialogue in Africa when it comes to improving transparency and sustainability, because new actors are coming into the sector with different motives, and the governance system and the transparency issues that we had before, or systems or frameworks that we have set up, may not be able to respond to these new challenges. So it's important that we discuss these topics and see from all perspectives, from the civil society, from the extractive industry, transparency standards, from the regulatory and legal frameworks, what we can use, of course, not forgetting the grassroots and ecological specialists of how we can drive the system to get to a more sustainable and transparent extractive industry in Africa. To start the discussion, I invite Dr. Oji Obonnaya Oji, who is the Executive Secretary at Nigeria Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative, and also the Chair of the Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative Global Network on Contract Transparency. Dr. Oji, you are welcome. Dr. Oji would make his opening statements, followed by Justin, Ben, and then Albert. Dr. Oji, over to you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, and all the distinguished panelists. I pay tribute to the School of Public Policy in Calgary for this wonderful initiative, especially at this time where issues in the oil, gas, and mining sector are defining international diplomacy as regards to the engagement between the Western powers and on issues concerning Russia and Ukraine, which is already affecting the entire world. I'm very honored to have been invited to speak, and I will just quickly share with you some basic information that I think will be very helpful for our discussion. When we talk about an industry transparency initiative, we're referring to a global initiative that came out of a World Conference on Development held in South Africa in 2003, where the then Prime Minister of Britain, Tony Blair, felt that it was important for resource-rich countries to come together to find a solution to resource costs. A resource costs and a situation where countries blessed with oil, gas, and mining resources always find their population in poverty. I think that discussion led to the Lancaster meeting held, another conference held in Lancaster House in London in 2004, where the EITI was born. Nigeria joined the Extractive Industry Transparency Initiative in 2004 and became implementation this same year, and became the first country to support implementation with a specific law. And then support the implementation with a specific law. Our mandate is simply working with 56 countries around the world to be able to bring enthroned transparency, accountability, and good governance in our oil, gas, and mining industries. We are governed by a multi-stakeholders group made up of 15 eminent Nigerians from the civil society, from the companies, and from government. I'm a member of that board. And our job is specifically enthroning discipline, resource governance mandate defined by process, transparency, and accountability in the sector. Of course, there are currently 56 member countries in the EITI. All of us are governed by the 2019 EITI standard and defines rules of engagement with between companies, government, and civil society in managing reform initiatives under the EITI global standard. For us in Nigeria, over the last 17 years, there are several issues challenging that have created various challenges in terms of sustainability. One of them we are battling with at the moment is the issue of crude theft. This is a global phenomenon, but it has much more deep-rooted culture in sub-Saharan Africa, and Nigeria is bearing a lot of brunt. For the reports we've done just in 2020, our country is losing $44.73 million dollars, $44.73 million as at our 2020 report. And this is just data supplied by 6 companies. Of course, the report we did in 2020 was covered by 69 companies, both local and international. So crude theft and vandalization of pipelines and oil and gas assets are costing Nigeria a lot, and it's a very big issue in our country at the moment. In 15 years, it's estimated that we may have lost $28.78 billion, and that's from 2006 to 2020, just the last 2 years. And on daily basis, it's also estimated that we may have lost $5.31 million on a daily basis, 160 million monthly, and about $1.92 million annually. It's a very, very big challenge that we are currently dealing with. The other issue that we're dealing with is what we call subsidizing the availability of petroleum PMS, petroleum products within the country, availability of fuel for local consumption. And we have better for what Nigeria is currently paying. We are also dealing with the issue of gas flare. Flaring gas currently in the country is a very big issue. And the implication of all this on the environment, both crude theft and subsidy, is a very huge issue. We're also having a zero refining capacity, but currently all the refineries that we are dealing with in Nigeria are currently not working. And we have currently depending on importation of products supply for 200 million Nigerians, which is a very huge Herculean task. So these are clear challenges on sustainability. Well, we are currently focusing on dealing with these issues on a very large scale. And one of them is one of those areas that we have really focused on is on managing and reforming, providing reforms on these issues based on a very strong legal framework. And that's why from 90 reports, Nigeria were able to recommend the implementation and the enactment of Petroleum Industry Act, which was lasted over 20 years in the parliament. We're able to get that out, was signed into law this year, and 90 is currently working on the Presidential Implementation Committee to implement the Petroleum Industry Act, which we call in Nigeria PIA, Petroleum Industry Act. Well, my emphasis on this is on how this law alone will be able to deal with all the problems we have mentioned. And we are now looking at a total of 107 regulations being drafted out of the law, with also model contracts. It's a huge task that the 9-member Presidential Committee is dealing with. When we are done with this and implementation comes on stream, the new look of the oil and gas industry in Nigeria will be completely very attractive for investment. We're equally looking at using the EITI framework to focus more on developing our gas resources and gas reserves. The new gas structure, distribution structure and infrastructure is already on the offering. And we're looking at 5.8 trillion cubic meters of gas reserves that are yet untapped. We're equally focusing on the deregulation of the industry sector, looking at the kind of potentials that will bring to our economy, almost $28.78 billion if this happens, will be available for as revenues that will flow into the country on an annual basis. We're also looking at also working with relevant agencies and reviving the railway system as a result of the kind of support that the railway infrastructure will bring into the country in terms of distribution of gas, both gas and oil and gas products. The rail infrastructure is going throughout the entire country, and it's a huge investment that is in a lot of toll on government revenue. So we equally looked at, also looking at how implementation in Nigeria would be aligned to the government economic programs at the moment. One of them is the Economic Recovery and Governance Plan project of the government. And we needed the ERGP to be a kind of economic blueprint from where implementation could be anchored. At the moment, Nigeria is leading, is among the 10 implementing countries that are championing energy transition, beneficial ownership, open data, and mainstreaming. I currently chair the 20-member country contract transparency network, looking at how contracts have been used in the past to defraud or lower the revenue earnings of member countries, and also how contracts have been drafted in such a way that it creates a huge implementation and transparency issues in terms of understanding and implementation. Many of these contracts are drafted in such language and technology and tax that is very difficult for most countries in sub-Saharan Africa to understand them. Those are issues that we are dealing with at the moment. And under the Global EIT Transparency Network, we are looking at how contracts can be simplified, made available, and provided in such a way that citizens can interrogate them. We could use that approach to see how projects can be implemented with resources achieving much with less. We're also looking at how data can be open and accessible, mainstreaming data in such a way that citizens can access this information, understand how to use the data to ask informed questions that promote reforms. On the whole, the extractive industry in Nigeria is completely untapped. A lot of potentials are buried in the sector, little or no much investment. At the moment, saying that in course of our interaction, I'll be able to take some more questions. I'm only giving 7 minutes to speak. I think I would like at this moment to hand over to Aka for other proceedings. I thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Hodges, for those very insightful initiatives that NAITI is leading in Nigeria, and of course at the global level with improving transparency in contracting in the sector. We'll get more from you when we get to discussions. Justin, are you ready? Please.
I'm here. Thank you very much. Thank you very much for having me, and to all the participants for listening at whatever time of day it is where you are. As the global need for new resources grows, and particularly now with the Ukraine and Russian war, the world is looking to find other sources for resources. And as I see it, Africa has a unique and wonderful opportunity. The opportunity is to shape our regulatory requirements and frameworks in a way which supports sustainability and the 3 pillars of ESG, or environmental social governance. The unfortunate corollary is that a failure to do so is very likely to lead to the unsustainable extraction of mineral resources, which ultimately does not serve the interest of present or future generations or the extractive industry as a whole. On this basis, I recommend that to prevent medium to long-term unsustainable practices and unsustainable resource depletion, which is currently, unfortunately, a very real risk, any African mineral extraction framework should look to and be informed by global best practice. mineral extraction regulation should not only be about making investment easier and expediting the project development process, but also about ensuring sustainability. In the past 2 years, Herbert Smith Freehills, which I consult to, has assisted the Saudi Arabian Ministry of Minerals with drafting regulations which give effect to its mining investment law. In drafting those regulations, we look to global best practice, including in the environmental, health and safety, and social context. The result, in our view, is world-class regulations, which will hopefully attract global investment from responsible mining houses. Significantly, the regulations require comprehensive environmental impact assessments, which must specifically consider, for example, climate change, an impact which was only fairly recently incorporated into the South African requirements, for example, as well as the World Bank or IFC requirements. And in addition, particularly given the tragic events relating to tailings dam collapses in the past few years, the regulations also include extensive requirements in relation to tailings dam management. These were informed by the ICCM's Global Industry Standard on Tailings Management, which has recently been updated. The regulations also require social impact studies and social impact management plans. More recently, the Saudi Arabian government has launched an auction for certain mineral reserve areas. The auction is primarily aimed at stimulating investment and industry in the Saudi Arabian minerals industry. Under the Saudi Arabian vision for 2030, Saudi Arabia places significant emphasis on sustainability and the role that mining will play in the diversification of its economy, particularly through the adoption of world-class sustainability practices. The auction process is the first opportunity to show this commitment, and therefore HSF fully anticipates that environmental and social considerations will be a critical factor in the decision-making process for selecting the preferred bidder. A similar position exists in South Africa in terms of our renewable energy program. Bidders must demonstrate environmental compliance and social commitment. Environmental considerations are also a key component of mining-related applications in South Africa. Our framework environmental legislation requires decision makers to consider environmental matters in any decision which may have an impact on the environment. And our definition of environment is wide enough to encompass social aspects. Requiring these considerations early in the development process is an excellent way to embed sustainability considerations from cradle to grave. And lastly, any regulatory framework needs to accommodate for the increasing expectations for transparency. In South Africa, we have seen significant developments in our courts, and in particular, the court's appreciation for the role that civil society plays in protecting the environment. This inevitably requires that civil society should be entitled to expect and receive relevant environmental information during both the environmental impact assessment process, as well as during operation, decommissioning, and post-closure. Civil society has recently been using other more innovative means to secure transparency and disclosure, shareholder activism, and to some extent, media shaming. Although it's taken time, and in many corporates are actually not there yet, in my view, South Africa's legal position on the need for access to information is excellent, and on how that information will be distributed is equally excellent. This should, in my view, ultimately enable corporate accountability and responsibility, which will lead to sustainability in the long term. Ultimately, we should not forget that the underlying motivation for sustainability practices is to ensure sustainable and long-lasting business. Essentially, this means that there are three fundamentals to doing business sustainably. One is do no harm to the environment. Two is do no harm to society. And number three, from a governance perspective, is do not lie. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Justin, for those words that you used in finishing. Do no harm to the environment, do no harm to society. and do not lie. Later on, we would know if those are actually being practiced by stakeholders. Those. We'll now move over to Ben. Ben, are you ready?
Yes, Aka, I'm ready. Thank you very much for this opportunity and to all of you for organizing this. I think this is a very important topic that we have to deepen conversations around. And transparency means everything for Africa resource owners. And I must say that over the past decade or two, we have made significant progress in ensuring that there is transparency around contracting, around revenue disclosures, and the behavior of companies in general, which sometimes we take for granted because, like Oliver Twist, there is always room for more. We appreciate the fact that illicit flows, we still have a long way to deal with them. And to that extent, greater transparency is required. But we shouldn't lose sight of the fact that a lot of work has been done, that today, the multilateral institutions like the World Bank, the IMF, have strict requirements on transparency around environmental and social impacts, which requires that companies that are sourcing financing from these institutions adhere to those standards. Countries like the United States, Canada, and the OECD, in general, have adopted transparency rules, which are ensuring greater disclosure of information that are critical and enhancing impact, in resource-rich countries. Development partners have been critical. International donor agencies, NGOs have all been playing a role to ensure that those transparencies requirements are enforced. And as Dr. Oji just spoke about, EITI has become an important movement that really is ensuring that revenue data is available. Companies subscribe to these transparency requirements. And, that has provided data for citizens to engage around payment contracts and the rest of it. But, whilst these progress have been made, which we continue to ask for more, we are recently seeing a new twist, that is injecting fresh challenges into resource governance and access to data and transparency around resource governance. And that specifically has to do with, the influx of businesses and individuals from the East, particularly China, into the extractive sector, where not much attention is paid to where we are coming from. The data transparency requirements, revenue transparency requirements are not important to businesses and individuals that are coming from that part of the world. And if you blend that with emerging local businesses and political influences, which I actually called local complicities, it makes it really difficult for us to look into the future and say that we're going to deepen transparency and accountability in the space. Because these local businesses, often will have all the political power backing them, and they don't pay much attention to community concerns. They don't pay much attention to environmental concerns. And that is a major challenge we're having to deal with. The Chinese are part of now small-scale businesses in the extractive sector, particularly in the mines, and you ask yourself, if you have a major accident involving a small Chinese company that is destroying the environment, would you be able to, for example, sue them in international court like you would do with Shell, ExxonMobil, or ENI, which in the past, civil society and other individuals have done? That is a major challenge. You have local businesses that have the political backing. How are you going to deal with them? to get, the political response that is required to ensure that these guys adhere to the transparency requirements and also strict regulatory oversight that are required. So these challenges throw up a new challenge to the movement around transparency that we have seen in the past more than a decade, and therefore requires new tools and actions to be able to reverse the trend and ensure that we can effectively link resource extraction to benefit. Other than that, we're going to see a massive destruction of the environment, and also revenues are going to dwindle. And let me also add that a major challenge to lack of data and transparency in recent times has been, government's access to the stock market and international bond market, where they are raising financing rather than the traditional development partners and country-to-country negotiations, which always ensure that civil society was at the table. This time around, government goes to the market to go and borrow, and therefore there isn't any requirement for deeper engagement with citizens on how transparently sectors and discussions of this nature can be held. So it is becoming increasingly difficult for advocates to engage around issues of common interest to ensure greater transparency in the space. So we need new tools that helps us navigate these emerging challenges. And I think that we have to be much more aggressive to discuss these challenges and then, push it to the Chinese diplomatic community for them to recognize where we are coming from and the need for them to participate in that movement to ensure that companies anywhere in the world coming to Africa to work will be held to those strict transparency and accountability requirements. We also need to empower our citizens to be very active in holding governments and regulatory agencies accountable so that they can police whether it is local business or anybody who is coming into the space. If we don't do that, it's going to be difficult for us to continue holding the traditional mines and oil businesses to account, because sooner than later, they're going to realize that, we can all neglect the processes that we have been part of over several decades, and it becomes free for all and difficult to control, and data will be hardly available. And I think the time to act really is now to ensure that we can make progress and deepen transparency and accountability to be able to effectively link resource extraction to economic development of our continent.
Thank you very much, Ben, for throwing up those challenges that Ghana's extractive industry is facing. And it's not just limited to Ghana. In Nigeria, we are experiencing same problems. During the discussion, we would explore tools to address these challenges. Over now to Albert. Albert, are you ready?
Yes, thank you very much, Akar and distinguished panelists. I want to thank you in a very special way, the University of Calgary, particularly the ERGP program. I'll begin by putting the context this way, that having long life working in the mining and quarrying industry, matters of ecological restoration and matters of environmental sustainability can only be sustainable if we have these four considerations, particularly the four components. We are looking at economic component, we look at the cultural component, and we're looking at the social component even before the actual science comes in place, which is the restoration, which is the ecological component in a nutshell. Having said that, it's very important that I also bring forth the fact that extraction of minerals for important uses and specific reasons involves different methods and results in different types of impact on the environment and the community at large. Due to the impacts and the needs of the future land use, we must therefore plan and develop suitable restoration methods for mine sites that guarantee sustainable ecosystem services for desirable and sustainable livelihoods. In this context, a fair degree of understanding of what it takes is considerably required to drive the process to sustainability. However, it's also important just to draw a snapshot at key components of restoration is key in terms of bringing restoration to mainstream success. Naturally, the public or private sector will not engage with commitment on restoration matters unless it's significantly clear to them on what they stand to gain or lose. Now, with the exception of a few companies and governments, the African scenario largely remains one of being compelled to engage in restoration. This, however, presents a case of insufficient sensitization and learning to enhance sufficient behavior change impacting the community. And this is where the dynamism is. The fundamental advice for dialogue on the subject of restoration involves around economic, social, cultural, and ecological components. Understanding the components, therefore, and their dynamics and influence on the practice can help practitioners and resource managers develop the ability to unlock the mystery behind the failures or success of any restoration project across the globe, and for a particular case, Africa. This is essentially the foundation of sustainable restoration. But looking at the processes and level of interest built over the years for Kenya and the African scenarios, the years have magnified awareness and interest to engage. In Kenya, for instance, interest to engage is slowly becoming pronounced due to visible evidence of success in restoration, as well as increasing degradation across, which is causing insufficient ecosystem services. And these have already significantly compromised livelihoods. So people actually feel it. Now, but in Kenya, again, we want to look at what are the lessons learned. The Kenyan scenario has both the element of compliance and the initiative, and various mileage has been made in both cases. Penalties have increased over time, while the private sector continues to drive initiatives that are seen to give the governance efforts mileage. The Kenyan scenario has both the element of compliance and the initiative, but also it's very important to realize that the realization that specific matters and subjects must be addressed in particular way before the science takes the center stage, especially on the repair of ecosystems, which is very important for any useful dialogue to take place. In essence, that will determine the impact at the broader community level. Now, globally, ecological restoration requires aligned engagements for it to become a priority. But the impact to the community level are broader. So the gains made in restoration are becoming more pronounced, and remediation, rehabilitation, restoration showcases are being used as immobile resources for engagements to create awareness, to complement governance efforts in developing mechanisms, as well as accelerate the rates and levels of awareness. Governance and management systems, including recognition schemes, as well as penalties, are taking center stage also, both in private and public sectors, and the community is growing wiser and pressing for environmental treatments, restoration commitments before any extraction actions as well. Environmental activists are not left behind, and I think this is something that can be witnessed across the globe. People are becoming more sensitive to undertakings of various industries, and are equally gaining momentum in demanding for sustainable actions impacting communities and livelihoods. Knowledge sharing for both success and failures is becoming a common phenomenon where lessons are shared and collaboration is working through partnerships and also taking shape largely. In essence, we are saying that mining is an essential activity. We need minerals and the related resources for various human activities and commodities, for medical facilities, for infrastructure and superstructures, and the list is long. But in conclusion, I want to say that while these alterations on ecosystems are happening, ecosystems are suffering, but there is always a solution and an opportunity to bring back the natural beauty of this environment. And this is where the lifeline of humans are. In essence, we're also saying that humans and ecosystems have always been together since time immemorial, from the beginning of the world. And therefore, ecological aspect and component of sustainability comes right at the bottom of the scale. So it has to go through the process of economic, cultural, social, and ecological comes to fix those transformations and therefore reestablish a trajectory that was there before the industries caused the alterations on the ecosystems. Back to you, Aka.
Thank you very much, Albert. For want of time, we won't go deep into the experiences that need to be shared, because fact is that across Africa, Nigeria inclusive, there are lots of ecological damages, deterioration and degradation that needs remediation. And it will be interesting to share tools and experiences of how we can get our environment and ecological systems back to what it used to be, if not much better. For time, we'll just take a question from a discussion point from panelists. I'd like to go over to Dr. Orji. Dr. Orji, please. Ben highlighted the challenges that Africa's extractive industry is facing, particularly Ghana. He mentioned Ghana, where he's situated. The influx of criminal elements that are not interested in adhering to the regulations and the standard. And to now ask, with the current demand for gas from elsewhere that is not Russia, and Nigeria's intention to put in place 107 regulations to drive Petroleum Industry Act, how prepared is Nigeria and of course other African 80 member states to ensure that there is no untwisting in abandoning reforms that promote transparency and sustainability in the extractive industry?
Well, for us, it's a huge challenge. I would be in no position now to be so categorical, because all over Africa and sub-Saharan Africa, we are faced with common challenges of political instability. We also are faced with common challenges of frequent policy reversals that does not really allow for consistency in policy implementation. But assuming it's an assumption now that we have some form of stability in our polity, and in terms of, because I know a number of countries currently who are member countries of the EITI in sub-Saharan Africa are either facing suspension or are faced with challenges. Currently, Guinea is a member of the EITI, also having challenges on their membership. Those kind of situations also in Burkina Faso here, where we're having challenges of instability. So political stability is key to the implementation and the reforms. Frequent policy reversals has been the case in most of our countries. Our country currently, this year, as you are aware, is a presidential general election is this year, and a new government is expected to come in Nigeria in May 2023. There should be a new government. We're also working very hard to see how what has been achieved will sustain, and then sustained by the next administration. That's been a challenge we have continued to deal with every year. But in the developed world, these things are taken for granted in the sense that politics and institutions don't exist side by side. So that's one. The other one is on the widening scope of the EITI standards. We are currently reviewing the EITI standard, and we are expected to have a new standard when the global conference of the EITI goes next year. Next year is the global conference. It holds every 3 years. The one we're implementing now was adopted in France, in Paris, in 2016. So next year we expect a new standard. Member countries have been asked to interrogate what is going on now, and they'll be able to. So we will need to refine the standard to deal with these issues. If you look at the issues my brother from Ghana has mentioned, it's all over the sub-Saharan Africa. In Nigeria, it's illegal mining. You know, mining activities are very small scale and they're illegal. None of those people, they don't pay tax, they don't pay royalty. And the destination of our minerals are to jurisdictions that have no responsibility whatsoever to the environment, no responsibilities to the country. So, and I highlighted the issue of oil theft. I highlighted the issue of oil theft. This is not, it's an international business. So, and it's not, those who get involved in these businesses are not small people. They are very rich syndicates and they operate internationally. Those are challenges that are beyond them. In terms of environment, it's a huge issue. Even if you transit from oil to, as we are trying to energy transition, what happens to the environment? The environment in the Niger Delta has been so devastated that it's almost very difficult, impossible, if not impossible, to revive. Those who live in those communities do not have access to fishing, clean water to fish. They don't have access to farmlands. They don't have access to even drinking water. They depend on these things. The environment is polluted. They die of diseases as a result of pollution. Those are very complex issues. But I do know that sister countries like Ghana are learning from some lessons and mistakes we made, because when we found oil in 1957, and I mean, we abandoned a lot of other opportunities that are available in Nigeria. I think other sister countries are learning to be much more sensitive to this issue. But it requires regional and global approach to deal with, beyond just the local jurisdiction. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Oji, for those important responses. Ben, over to you. Dr. Oji had raised a very important point as to the sector being a sector that is that everyone is responsible for. It's an international business, and political stability is required to ensure that reforms are seen through from start to finish. Sometime in 2018, while I was at ASEP, because why I'm bringing this context is that ASEP sits at that center when it comes to policy making, advocacy, and intervening in Ghana and in the West African sub-region. I was aware that, or rather, I worked partly in developing some work on the framework for policy and the legal framework for local content in the mining sector in Ghana. How far has that effort by the Ghanaian government gone, and how has it shaped the mining sector in Ghana? And additionally, what do you think tanks such as ASEP and civil society should do to bring this conversation on the table, and possibly if dragging is needed to bring, for instance, the Chinese that you mentioned on the table to have these very difficult discussions?
Yeah, thank you very much, Aka. I think in the past we were under the illusion that once we support the policy development, it translates into implementation and action. But it turns out that there is more work to be done even after the policy has evolved, and that is the sad reality that we are faced with, not just in Ghana but across the region, where you engage several years to get a policy done. New political interest emerges. They have no interest to understand what happened in the past, what necessitated policy, and political interest drives actions. So accountability is a big step away from the transparency we have achieved and legal requirements we have developed over time. So we really need to move into, holding institutions and political actors accountable and businesses accountable to ensure that it's not just about developing policy, but policies that are developed can be implemented. And even where policies don't exist, good practice can be done, because there are many practices that can be adopted without even having a legal framework to deal with them if political actors and businesses want to do the right thing. So we have embraced that challenge to realize that we need to swiftly move into holding all of us accountable. We have to keep pushing for new policies, but most importantly, we need to extract action from those who have to be held accountable and responsible for the developments that are happening across us. That lack of accountability is throwing up a lot of challenges. As I indicated earlier, in the past, if governments in the region went for loans from countries, the requirements were always that you have to engage your citizens, right? So those conditionalities made it mandatory for them to engage civil society, public policy, organizations like us. But today, they're going to the bond market, to go and raise money where there is no requirement for you to even engage your citizens. So most of the new politicians that we are seeing don't care about the citizens. They see the 4 or 5 year mandate as the right to annex the state until the next election, all right? And that is a major challenge that we have to navigate going forward. And that's why I indicated that the major tool we need is active citizens that holds people accountable in between elections, so that we are not just waiting for the sprinkling of development and promises close to the election, but in between the elections, we can still hold policymakers accountable and ensure that resource sector plays its role in development.
Thank you very much, Ben. Active citizens are the only people that could drive accountability, and I agree very much, of course, with the work I'm doing in the extractive industry. In the mining sector, to be specific, in Nigeria, I quite agree with you. Justin, following up from what Ben said, that active citizens are responsible, I would like you to tell us about the South African experience, where the courts ruled that the Department of Environment have to take greater measures to protect, to improve air quality. How did that happen? Was the citizens responsible in getting these court judgments? How did it happen? Please share with us.
Sure. The case is actually known as the deadly air case. And what happened is a number of kind of NGO type activists brought a claim against the department for failing to publish regulations which basically enable the enforcement of air quality regulations. In South Africa, we've had quite a challenge because we have a number of old plants which release quite toxic air. And those old plants are quite critical for things like energy. So, for example, the Eskom power stations and the Sasol plant, which is responsible for producing a lot of our petroleum in South Africa. And because those plants are very old, they cannot be retrofitted to meet new plant standards. So although the law has been published in a way which seeks to give them time to transition to improved environmental standards and air quality standards, they have not yet been able to do so, and therefore the air quality, particularly in the Highveld region, is atrocious, and the department itself has recognized that the poor air quality is leading to untimely deaths of people. And as a consequence of this, the court has ordered that the department needs to enforce the regulations more strongly, and in particular by publishing improved regulations which enable it to take that enforcement action. So it's been a long time coming, and it's going to be very interesting to see what both Eskom and Sasol do, particularly because we need power and we need fuel. So for me, it's particularly interesting because when I've given lectures on the balance that needs to be met between environmental, economy, and social, I always say, well, in South Africa, are we going to choose between health, or are we going to choose between energy? And how do we do that? And I think the court has made that decision very clear for us. But I don't envy the minister in terms of how she's going to address those regulations. But she's got 12 months to do that. Just one thing that I wanted to add to Ben's comment is I fully support that active citizenship is a critical role that we need to play. But in the South African context, and I don't know whether this has happened in other African jurisdictions, I know that it has been a problem in South America, is that environmental activists are actually murdered. And we have had 2 cases in South Africa where this has been the case, both because some people, for example, want a mine to take place because they think that it'll create jobs, etc., and then they murder the people that are opposed to it. So that's a very scary trend that we are seeing in the South African context, and I know that it's not just here, but I don't know whether that's similarly happened in Ghana.
Thank you, Justin. Very interesting discussions that we might have to go on and on talking about. Albert, please, your space is a very interesting space because when all the deed is done, the environment is polluted, the ecology is devastated. We resort to specialists like you to help remediate. How do you think extractive businesses in the continent should approach ecological restoration? I ask this because I wouldn't want to mention names, but in Nigeria, I have been leading an effort to get a mining host community to approach the courts, and there had been several hearings. They got a court decisions for a certain cement manufacturer to pay them damages for lots of things that they have done. And it seems as though Bumbari has a very pragmatic approach of looking at environmental and ecological restoration with all the work that has been done with the forest trails and the helipack. Tell me about the approach that you guys at Lafarge have implemented in creating an environment that sustains not just the business that you do, but the local communities. And what other African countries might learn, particularly Nigeria, because lots of environmental pollution and degradation is taking place here.
Thank you very much, Aka, and distinguished panelists. Let me begin by saying I work for the largest or the biggest mining company in Kenya and in the region. And this is Bamburi Cement, which is a member of Lafarge Wholesale, and it's a very global company. And we have huge mining processes taking place in the region, particularly in Kenya, where I'm directly involved in the restoration process. We are operating in several counties where mining is directly taking place, particularly on limestone, pozzolana, shell, and calcium. So in actual sense, what we are saying is that there is massive environmental degradation taking place. But this is what I want to emphasize. Restoration is best served on a plate called initiative. And this is very important because my experience when I joined the company is that there was a complete paradigm shift in the way I used to look at restoration and environmental issues. Because I found that this company started restoration process not because they were compelled, but because it was an initiative. And this initiative has driven a passion, and this passion has over the years become a culture. And this is what I really want to emphasize. And I want also to borrow from what Ben said about policy. If you develop policy and there is no initiative and there is no passion, this culture will not emerge. And the culture you're going to have is one that requires compelling issues of compliance, therefore governance trains. So you have a government that has to whip people around, has government that has to whip communities, whip institutions, but this becomes a very difficult process. Now, looking at what the process has been and what can we take home in terms of igniting this momentum, there are 4 components that are critical as a snapshot for this process. Number 1 is the economic, and this means that when you're talking about environmental sustainability and you're looking at mining companies and any other form of degradation, you must understand that there is a cost associated with it. Second, this is where people narrow down their systems. They focus too much on the cost and they lose the opportunity that it presents. And this opportunity is hidden in the economic benefit called ecosystem services. So we have a huge multiplier effect in the ecosystem services, but only after you have uncovered that opportunity and created something more. In this case, I'm looking at here you have a mining site, literally a barren landscape that has already been completely detached from any development. And you want to build it to a net positive impact, meaning you want to bring something even much bigger than what was there. And this is where the passion has to drive the process. The second component, and this is what I will really emphasize that also people look at, is the cultural component, that from mining, you must look at it that people and ecosystems existed from the very early formation of life. You are born and you start interacting with grass and trees and air and rain and everything. And until you understand that process, you will start driving restoration and separating people from your decisions. So the question of a deteriorating or degrading ecosystem, whether it's from mining or is from basically any other activity, from climate change, it needs to be understood from the perspective that you cannot separate communities from ecosystems, meaning you cannot separate restoration from the people. The third component that I would like to highlight in this discussion is that it is a very, very important social component. And the social component, this is a typical scenario for a social component. Look at who is here. Experts in your own rights, significantly addressing the same problem, but from different dimensions. Meaning, that each and every idea and initiative and experience or expertise that comes from your roles in different parts of the world culminates into that fundamental sustainability aspect that we are looking for. So under the social component, my experience in this company and other activities that I've done elsewhere, for you to understand the success factor that will be termed as sustainable, you must bring together what you call the stakeholder integration. So the social component, in other words, you are looking at stakeholder integration. So you're looking at both technical stakeholder, policymakers like yourselves, legal experts like yourselves, engineers like yourselves, energy specialists like yourselves, teachers, educators in the systems, fishermen. Bring them together and they form a good dimension of the social component of restoration. Now, this is where things get really bananas, where you have not patched your social component correctly, so activists have to help you to do your job. And when the activists, environmental activists come in place, you are going to find yourself spending on a lot of battles that you would have actually avoided. So your energy must be channeled in convincing people by simply asking yourself two fundamental questions. Who will benefit from this restoration? Who is likely to lose if I don't restore? Now, either way, the people who are likely to lose will be on your case if you don't address it. The people who are likely to benefit will be on your case if you don't involve them. So the social component is the nuts and bolts of this restoration process. So finally, the Alberts come in play, the scientists. The scientists come in only when all the systems are functionally well placed. It's only then that sustainable solutions will be born from the science. So what is the ecological? This is the ecological component. The ecological component significantly now brings all principles of science into converting the barren system, in this case, the degraded system or the destroyed ecosystem, or the quarries, the mines, whether it's underground or open pit. Now, the science comes in with principles that will transform that site into ecosystems. Now, we go back to the economic. Immediately, the scientists have addressed the ecological component. It becomes a continuum, meaning that now the benefits of all these closed systems that is functionally supporting each other starts delivering ecosystem services. And these ecosystem services, again, must be sustained by the policymakers, the politicians, the teachers, the governance specialists, the legal experts, the conservationists. They must again start playing their handwork into the entire system. And at the end of the day, what we have in conclusion, you have a clock on your wall and only one little screw, one little nut. Your clock will be saying 3 a.m. when it's supposed to be saying 2 p.m. So restoration fails in most cases at the planning level because you do not bring together a good understanding of the economic, the cultural, the social, and ecological components. Now, until you understand the perspectives and the dynamics around these four components, your restoration process will not be sustainable. Thank you, Aka.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Albert. It's a very broad topic that we can't, will be difficult to exhaust in this discussion, but I tell you something would explore opportunities to share experiences and to ensure that all the components are working together perfectly to ensure that ecosystem services are working perfectly for extractive industries. Thank you very much, our panelists, Dr. Orji, Ben, Albert, and Justin. I will now hand over to Alim, who will do the Q&A section. Over to you, Alim.
Thank you, Aka, and thank you, everyone. We have a few questions that I'd like to come to in the Q&A, but I want to start by coming back to this piece that both Justine and Albert have touched on. And this is the notion of how critical activists are. And I'd like to come to, I'll ask everyone, in fact, but I want to explore just for a minute here this relationship between activism and security. Justine asked what kinds of violence and dangers are faced for activists and environmental defenders in other parts of the continent. So perhaps I'm going to come and start with Ben. So Ben, I wonder if you could speak to that in terms of Ghana, and then I'll ask Aka as well, and Albert and Dr. Orji. So please, Ben.
Yeah, thanks, Alan. I think that is a very important subject introduced by Justine. And as I indicated, I mean, when you have this interplay between, entrants who are less susceptible to regulation, and then also local actors, working together, it makes it difficult, and security becomes an important conversation. In the past, we were dealing with external actors, and therefore it was easier to deal with. But you now have the Asian entry that is really working with local businesses, and that heightens, the level of security for activists and individuals who wants to push for greater transparency and sustainability in the space. And that is why I keep saying that we need more voices in the space, so that targeting becomes much more difficult. Getting people capacitated to understand the threats they face, the risk levels they're exposed to, whilst still pursuing that line of actively engaging on issues of transparency and accountability, even when the threats are higher than they used to. So it's real that, I mean, when we do know that the resource sector gets people rich quicker, and therefore people want to defend where their wealth is coming from, and that poses a lot of risk to those of us who are in the space. But that awareness is important to how you survive navigating that space, and the need to get as many people in that space as possible to highlight the issues we face, and also advocating for improved governance and the security architecture to ensure that it is not exceedingly manipulated, as we do have currently in our context. And that makes a lot of crime go undetected, and therefore threatens individuals who are working in that space. But I acknowledge that that is a major thing we're having to deal with at this point.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Ben. I know that Aka, who's worked a great deal at the community level, will certainly have some insights on this. I wonder if you can speak to this question on the basis of your work.
Well, it's always a challenge traveling to see for myself and to engage with these local communities, because you never know who's the part of the businesses, who is colluding with them, who is an informant, and there are all those challenges. And it's become more difficult with poor infrastructure that makes it difficult to travel fast, and also possibly have an escape route when you need to leave immediately. And I think it becomes more problematic when there is a signal from the regulators and the or the agencies that should actually get the companies to comply. And when that happens, it seems as if it would be a sitting duck. I've had situations where I had to abandon the work I'm on and seek refuge somewhere else. And unfortunately, maybe this is the first time I'll be saying this, or people would know that I'm associated with this form of work, because in the sector where I am, I still encounter these businesses, but they don't know that I'm responsible for some of the interventions that go on in those communities. And maybe after now, it will be more of a security concern for me to watch my back. And actually, I was telling a friend a joke in a certain part of Abuja where I visit very often. The person whose house is directly opposite the house I normally visit or spend time is owns a company. I try to get their work difficult in the communities where I work. And this place is heavily guarded. And sometimes I wonder, I tell the people that I visit, if this man knows, and we greet, it's very funny. Many times when he's outside, we greet, interact. I'm friends with the kids, but he doesn't know that the work I do is such a work that impedes the business that he does. So it's a very risky issue and must be taken seriously. Particularly, of course, in an environment where there is a breakdown of law and there is no rule of law, it becomes even more difficult to police things that are happening in the sector.
Thank you, Aka. We may have to redact some of this recording for you on the basis of this. I'm going to just go quickly to Albert. If you could just say a few words so that we can understand a bit of the context in Kenya. And then in the remaining about 5-6 minutes we have, I have a couple of other questions that I will pose to the panel. So if Albert is there, we can ask him. I think, there we go.
Yes, very much here. The situation in Kenya is quite interesting right now. Basically, the government is coming in very strongly with governance tools. But the very interesting part is that the private sector is also pushing very hard, is building more of a sense of competition in terms of being environmentally visible. And this is quite interesting. The most interesting part is increasing dialogue on matters of restoration. And this increasing dialogue is actually playing the social component the correct way. In most cases, we sit in various forums where the government is now more of the catalyst, is actually driving the engagements, creating platforms, and using the success stories to create a passion or an appetite for others to follow. There's also an emerging component, an emerging item where schemes like recognition schemes, giving an award for the best bees and the best on matters relating to the environment. But also one, if you're following the Kenyan environmental issues closely, you realize there's concerted effort in banning things like plastics. Now, while we may look at restoration from the mining perspective, but also some of the material that is not useful, not good for the ecosystem, also ends into a restoration mode because then they need to be removed from the ecosystem. So what are we saying? We're saying that restoration in this process is going beyond the mining sector, it's going beyond the government, it's going beyond the private sector. It's taking a partnership, collaborative approach because there is this synergy where complementarity is becoming more valued than before. So if you have experts in the private sector, experts in the government sector, they engage in a dialogue, they bring about a more practical solution on the table. So the gaps are there, the challenges exist, and they will continue. However, the progress can be seen as making significant strides towards resolving some of the environmental issues.
Thank you, Albert. I think this has done a really excellent job of covering these dynamics between activism, security, and how these social relationships coalesce. I have a question in the chat here, which speaks to the EITI disclosures. So I'm going to pose this to Dr. Orji, but also to Ben. The question is, as part of EITI disclosures, Chinese companies having a sizable materiality threshold are required to disclose basic data on resource-backed loans and revenues paid to government. But what kind of additional data should we be requiring from, let's say, external companies, foreign companies, and how can we advocate for additional information disclosure? Dr. Orji, I'll ask you to speak to that from the EITI level, and then for Ben to follow up.
Thank you very much, Justin. This is very key. That's why the EITI is implementing the beneficial ownership. A beneficial ownership disclosure goes beyond just disclosing data. We need to know the names and the faces behind the oil and gas assets, oil, gas, and mining assets. You disclose those who are into these businesses, the names and details, the information that actually will help you to understand the political economic issues around the transaction or the business. The EITI is also providing this as something that needs that has implication to tax evasion, has implication to terrorism financing, has implication to fraud in terms of capital flights. And more importantly, beneficial information is very important for planning around the whole issues of environment. Currently, it's a big issue in the EITI. There is a lot of resistance to this aspect of EITI requirement. But there is also an aspect of contract transparency. What is the kind of contracts that underpin this transaction? Shouldn't the host communities be aware and the citizens, the civil society be open to these contracts? And at what level do you disclose these contracts? Because most of the companies that operate in these zones have what they call confidential, sign what we call joint operational agreements, and sometimes they sign confidentiality agreements with this company, with the host communities or with government. So this contract transparency disclosures and beneficial ownership disclosures are new emerging issues to deepen transparency in these issues. We don't have time, but the issues about security that we all discussed brought us on the need why the EITI introduced the civil society protocol for implementing countries to ensure that those activists who work in the environmental sector and are protected. So when countries sign on to the civil society protocol, they have a responsibility to widen and protect this big space for engagement. And then most countries had to adapt the civil society protocol to their environment. Not all countries that are in the EITI globally have been able to sign the civil society protocol. So getting countries to sign that civil society protocol places a burden on them to make sure that activists in those zones are protected. Because the kind of information that we get are very scary about activists being killed on site, and then security harassment of those who are generally meant to disclose or handle some information and advocacy on behalf of those who cannot speak for themselves are usually harmed. So getting member countries to sign on the civil society protocol, which the EITI have crafted, is an ongoing debate. Nigeria is currently a signatory, and that's why implementing it is also another challenge that we all face. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Orji, and especially for these comments on the civil society protocol. And continuing with the question of additional information disclosure, Ben, do you have any comments on this piece in the Ghanaian context?
No, yeah, Alan, I think it's a very important question that I wish I had all the time to really deal with, and perhaps another session will be required. I mean, determining the materiality threshold for EITI is a big problem for many countries. In Ghana, for example, our threshold is $2 million, right? And let me give you a scenario where 50% of our gold output comes from the small scale sector. We're talking about close to 3 million ounces of gold, all right, coming from the small scale sector. And no company from that space qualified to be in the materiality threshold under EITI. So, and that is where the Chinese are playing. So that quantum of resources that are extracted, they don't pay tax. The government gets almost nothing from that space. We recently conducted a study looking at the quarry sector where no company qualified under the materiality threshold. And yet, these huge developments that are happening in Ghana relies very much on the quarry sector, all right? And that is where the Chinese are playing. And there is no data that really helps you to rope them into that threshold. And we did a quick scan that realized that as many as 15 companies or so could easily have qualified to be in that threshold. But because of data misreporting, they fall below the threshold to allow them to come into the EITI ambit. So those are critical issues that we can have time to really deal with to see how countries can navigate to be able to rope these companies into that threshold. But it is actually a space where complicity and again, the involvement of the Chinese is making it much more difficult to get data to rope that threshold.
But Ben, maybe we can help you here. The EITI in Ghana, the GAITI, the Ghana EITI, could get the multi-stakeholders group to review their thresholds from time to time. We do so every time, every now and then. In Nigeria, the oil and gas sector is $5 million. And the last report we did, 69 companies were covered. The solid mineral sector is very undeveloped, so we only have 3 million naira, which is very small when you convert it to dollar. So, but what our multi-stakeholders, because it is the multi-stakeholders group that set up the materiality threshold, we do is to review from time to time to allow more companies to come on stream. You know, when you lower, since your threshold, your materiality seems to be high, you could lower that threshold to allow more companies. And you need to also target those companies that you know are involved in illegal mining that are not either paying taxes or royalty. You need to find a space, you need to find a way to bring them into the fold, to pay taxes and royalty to the country, because otherwise there is no incentive why they should do business in the country. It's generally a challenge, I agree with you. But we also have to find a way to make our multi-stakeholders be more sensitive to adjusting the materiality thresholds from time to time. We do this annually, and the EITI allows that. Thank you.
Well, for our guests who wouldn't see this, I can tell you now that this question about materiality thresholds and disclosure has sparked a conversation among our panelists. I can see it going through the chat, and it looks like we'll have to plan a subsequent session in order to speak to this. But in closing here, I have a couple of things. I see a question in the chat about Albert Musando on the environment. Is there work being done to monitor environment investment funds? Albert, I'm going to ask you to answer that by typing a response to that guest. And then I want to close by asking everyone to answer this following question in just a couple of sentences. And it's this. We're going to start with Aka. And it is, how can developed countries support sustainability plans and expectations in Africa? Aka, what is your answer to that?
Well, I think it starts from their demands from us and allowing us, though that would be difficult because there is no, I mean, the pollution heaven hypothesis makes it possible or even easier for very bad things to happen in jurisdictions where regulation is lax. But one thing would be to allow the member states, the individual countries, developing countries, to shape their sectors the way that works for them. Of course, for instance, Ben, Ghana is having issue with materiality threshold, and from what Dr. Oji said, having those allowances for individual countries to define what these are for them is very important, so that every stakeholder or actor is brought in to account for what needs to be accounted for.
Thank you, Aka. I'd like to go now to Justine. What can be done to support sustainability plans and expectations?
I've been trying to give it some thought. One thing that I've been thinking about is the fact that recently the European or Europe has published an EU directive which requires that goods which come from outside of Europe meet certain demands, etc. And I know that is sort of using a whip approach rather than a carrot approach, but it may be a good way to ensure that sort of other countries start to up their sort of sustainability protocols and practices by requiring that those minimum requirements are met in countries that are not within Europe. I don't know if that makes sense.
It does. Thank you, Justine. It does to me at any rate. I'm sure to our guests as well. Albert and then Ben, and we'll give the final word to Dr. Orji here. Albert, what can we do to support these initiatives in sustainability? Oh, perhaps he's frozen. Okay, Ben, let me jump to Ben. Your answer, sorry.
Yes, I think, continuous engagement and, refining our thinking around emerging challenges is really critical. We need to continue to share what is working in different contexts to see how we align on a strategy that addresses emerging, and also not forgetting that we still have other challenges we're dealing with from the processes we have begun decades ago, dealing with illicit flows, to ensure that benefits really optimize in that space, So we need to continuously work around these issues and be able to come up with a much more robust approach that doesn't yield to emerging challenges as we have now.
Thank you, Ben. Albert, I see is back with us. Albert, we'll ask you the same, of course.
I lost you briefly, I think because of network stuff. Just go back again, please.
So we're just doing the closing roundtable here on the question of, what can be done from external partners and collaborators in terms of supporting African countries in meeting these sustainability plans and expectations. What can we do?
Thank you very much. First of all, my understanding has actually grown to understand that sometimes decisions are made in the wrong way because of insufficient knowledge about the subject. So in most cases, we have top-range professionals, but some of the information that they need to know to make the correct decisions is not placed on the table for them to explore and use their expertise to derive a more meaningful and practical solution. So in this case, that is where you hear Ben is saying things that are happening. It's known the decision that needs to be taken, but when he looks at it, the situation is taking a divergent, goes contrary to what is expected. So in most cases, the solutions are there, but the cards are not put on the table. So the kind of support that we need is more sensitization, more bringing the transparency item on the table, and allowing the experts to bring their expertise in terms of generating decisions and solutions for sustainability.
Thank you for that, Albert. And lastly, Dr. Orji has rejoined, a very busy man. I'll ask you for the final say on this in terms of what we can do to support sustainability plans and expectations.
Well, I will look at it differently from inwards. I think it also depends on the developing countries. They must take ownership, complete ownership of the process that works for their own people. They must take ownership of reforms that have been initiated and then find a way to adapt to global standards, not just following global standards without local content. The local content in the policy engagement is very key. And for developed countries, I think they could be more useful if they come by way of policy support, policy, not directive, not conventions, policy support, policy engagements, and then with the leadership of those countries. But political leadership from implementing countries is very key, because every country has its own diversity and peculiarities. So, and then other one is to help build the capacity of the civil society. The civil society capacity needs to be built both at the regional, urban, and national levels to be able to engage this issue. The civil society, strong civil society, helps to hold the conscience of leaders to account, and then helps to hold the conscience of the citizens, and it helps to shape discourse and the boundaries of reforms. So civil society, strong media, and then dissemination and public education and enlightenment are also very key for the citizens themselves, fully informed and enlightened, to be able to also restrain their leaders when, for instance, they are making wrong decisions or adopting wrong narratives that do not, nomenclature that do not represent the culture and the aspirations of their citizens. So it's both ways. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Orji. Thank you, a very, very sincere thank you to all of our panelists. I think that all of us who are here in the audience are going to be coming away from today's session with a lot to think about. And I know for our part at ERGP, some ideas for new types of important conversations that we may be able to have together in the future. So those of you who are still with us, the School of Public Policy is thanking you for being part of the discussion. I'll leave it there for today. And if anyone has follow-up questions or would like more information about our work at ERGP or the work of our panelists, they can write to us at ergp@ucalgary.ca. Thank you, everyone.